I am the program coordinator for JCC Chicago. We are thrilled to have you join us today. Just a couple of reminders. Please make sure that you remain on mute throughout the entirety of the presentation. It's hard when we have background noise. You can send your questions in the chat box, which we will get to at the end of the program. And it is my pleasure to introduce Roberta Kerr.
Thank you, Hillary, and welcome to everyone. This program is very dear to my heart, so I'm glad to have the opportunity to share it again. To begin, the title of this program, Attestations, was chosen very deliberately. As I'm sure most of you are aware, when someone signs up for military service, there's a mountain of paperwork that they have to fill out, forms of one sort or other. In the United States, they're generally called enlistment papers. In Canada, and in fact throughout the Commonwealth, they're called attestation papers. And I'm very drawn to how evocative that term is. Attestation meaning evidence showing, or the act of showing that something is true. The stories that I'm going to share with you are, with certain qualifications, true stories, most of them gleaned from the individual service records, from the attestation papers of some of the Canadian Forces veterans from Southern Alberta who are included on the Southern Alberta Jewish War Veterans of World War I and II database. Sorry, my slide did not click. There it is. This database is hosted on the website of Jewish Historical Society of Southern Alberta, JHSSA, and it was created in 2013 through the generous support of a man named Bernie Gert. That name will come up again, and the Gert Family Foundation. It's a searchable collection of primarily biographical data about the Jewish veterans of both the First and Second World Wars who have a significant connection to Southern Alberta. My maternal grandfather was one of those veterans, and I grew up with a great deal of respect for him, for everyone who served, who answered the call, rose to the challenge, in some cases couldn't get out of it. And that's really the point, is that each case is different. Each person was doing something different, was on their way to something different when that call came. And the more that we can learn about them, the more we get to know them as individuals, not just as statistics. And then we remember them all the better. The attestation papers, which are held by Library and Archives Canada, we call it LAC, are an invaluable tool, as they do often provide much more than just military information. A little procedural sidebar. There are two main differences when accessing military records in Canada and in the States. Generally speaking, anyone can access American records as long as the veteran's service was more than 62 years prior to the request. In Canada, relatives can access the records quite readily, but non-family members can only access records for veterans who have been deceased for more than 20 years. The other main difference in accessing the records is that the American National Archives charges $25 for a service record that's under 5 pages, $70 for a service record that's over 5 pages. And of course, most records are. For a small organization like Jewish Historical Society, that would make a project like the one we undertook prohibitively expensive. Fortunately for us, Library and Archives Canada offers another option. It's called a genealogy package. And if you request that instead of a full service record, the LAC clerks will go through the individual's full file and pull relevant papers. There's always their attestation and discharge papers. There are usually summaries of in-service interviews and assessments, sometimes medical records, information about troop movements. There's a broad range of information, usually anywhere from 15 to 30 pages. And a genealogy package is free. So thanks to that, we have been able to request records for almost 200 veterans. It has been my pleasure and privilege to learn about our veterans, whether it's through the formal records or through family lore and other informal sources. And every veteran story that you have ever heard, we do have someone who fits it. The fellow who enlisted on his birthday, the brothers who enlisted together, the one who was discharged early because of illness, the one who ended up making a career out of the military, someone who said goodbye to a wife and children so that they could go serve, those who got married during their service, those who got not only married during their service, but brought home their wife and new children. The prairie boy who was able to live out his dream of becoming a United States Marine, and the American who came north to sign up at the beginning of the war because he just couldn't wait. Of course, there are some stories that we don't know yet. When it comes to our female veterans, there's a real problem with tracking them down. Most of them were, of course, single when they enlisted, so their service records are under their original names. If they later married and took on their husband's name, it's very difficult to find the proof of death that we need in order to request their service record, because their proof of death, showing that they have in fact been gone for more than 20 years, will of course be under their married name. So it can take a great deal of searching. If the individuals have left Southern Alberta, it can be very difficult to know what names we need to be putting together in order to get their records. We do have 19 females in our database at this time, 3 Russians, 3 Brits, and 13 Canadians. One interesting thing, of the 13 Canadian women, 4 of them actually served in the American Army. And there are a couple of reasons for this. One of them is that nursing schools were sometimes easier to get into in the States than in Canada. And there were a lot of jobs, a lot of nursing jobs south of the border in the 1930s. So for Molly Raber, Leah Waterman, and Harriet Weitzer, they were all studying or working stateside in 1941 when America entered the war, and that's the service they joined. Now, Toby Molly Carnett was not a nurse. She had been born and raised in Calgary and had gone to Montreal, where she was selling war bonds, when she decided not just to enlist, but that she wanted to serve overseas. She felt that the odds of her doing that were better through the American military than through the Canadian one. And I don't know if that was true, but it certainly did turn out to be true for her. And in fact, of the Canadian service women whose service records we do know something about, they did all primarily serve in Canada. Now, speaking of things that may or may not be true, I couldn't give a presentation called Attestations without addressing issues of what can only be called lies, right there in the attestation papers themselves. Dates, for example, birth dates. We have a fellow named Lou Diamond who lived just west of Calgary. And when he was drafted during World War I, he tried so hard to get out of it. He claimed to be younger than he in fact was, and ended up with 3 different birth dates spanning a period of 4 years that are all part of his official record. It was much more common, of course, for people to lie about their age in order to serve. Consider the Klein brothers, Joe, Dave, Cecil, and Sam. Now, Joe was the eldest, born in 1918, and he joined the Air Force soon after war was declared. The youngest was Cecil, born in 1925, and he spent his later teens in the Naval Reserve. In between them, there was David, who was born in 1921. So he was just old enough when he enlisted in the fall of 1940. But to be on the safe side, he claimed to have been born in 1919. And he maintained that falsehood until the end of the war. Brother Sam also signed up in 1940, but he knew if he was honest about his age that he would be turned down. So he claimed that he was in fact already 19 and made it through, was sent to basic training in Ontario. After 2 months there, he received his first posting, which unfortunately for him was at Calgary District Depot 13. And I say unfortunately because he had only been back in Calgary for a very short time when he was in fact discharged as being between the ages of 17 and 18 at the time of application. And family lore suggests that Bessie, his mom, had something to do with the Army finding out how old he really was. I have no proof, and it can in fact be difficult to find proof about any number of things included on the attestation papers. There are often no other sources to confirm or deny what an individual has attested to. Anti-Ukrainian sentiment, for example, was rampant through much of Canada in the first half of the century. So people from there often claimed a different country of origin on their papers. Similarly, for reasons we all know too well, it was not uncommon for individuals to claim a religion other than Jewish, even when they were members of known Jewish families. We have a pair of brothers, in fact, one of whom existed as or enlisted as Jewish, the other one as Church of England. And an interesting twist on that, we have several veterans who enlisted as Protestant, but at some point during their service, their records were amended to read Jewish. And we're very glad that they made that change. They were part of our community. And quite a few of the veterans that we researched, when we started out, they were little more than names on a list or in the caption of a photograph. The attestation papers are often the first glimpse we get into the lives of those individuals. And sometimes we get really lucky and we realize that the person was very connected to our community in ways that we hadn't anticipated. A person like L. Wolf, who is just a name on a 1942 Jewish Congress list of veterans or of servicemen. And there was a Wolf family in Calgary, but there was no L, anywhere, no initial L. And these lists, we don't really know where they got their names, whether it was from a local family that was just somehow not on the radar, or if it was an individual who was just passing through. This L. Wolf, I started out with a cemetery search, and I went through JOBR, the Jewish Genealogy Online Worldwide Burial Registry, which is a marvelous resource. And I found a gravestone for a Louis Wolf. The dates on the mark looked right for World War II service, and he was buried just one province over in British Columbia, which has a much more temperate climate than Southern Alberta does. So it's very common to find that people originally from here have moved out there. So I took a chance and submitted a request for the records. And it turns out that not only was Louis born and raised in Calgary, he was in fact part of the Wolf family, but he had somehow been completely overshadowed by a much older brother who had been a World War I veteran and in fact had gone on to a career with the mounted police. We had thought that the family was well documented, but obviously we had been mistaken. Another name on a list that we weren't sure about was George Ruskin, who served with the Royal Canadian Navy. We knew there was a Ruskin family farming near Drumheller, east of Calgary during the 1930s, but as hard as we looked for George, we kept coming up blank. Cemeteries, newspaper articles, there was nothing. And then I found a couple of online references to some artwork that had been donated in memory of a George Ruskin in 1994. Now, I had no idea if that was our George Ruskin, but it was 20 years, more than 20 years earlier. So I submitted a request, and his attestation papers not only confirmed that he was part of the family that we had suspected, but there was other biographical data on the forms that made us curious as to how we had missed him when we'd conducted our previous cemetery search. So we went back, and with the date of birth and his father's name, we realized that he was in fact in one of the cemeteries we'd looked at before. It was just that the cemetery records had him listed under his middle name, George Joseph Ruskin. The file we received for George was not the only one that led us to that sort of new information. Sam Tenbaum, we actually knew nothing about him except that he was a captain, according to one of the local Congress lists. So we entered him into our database with that bit of information and requested records. And almost overnight, our record for him, turns out he was born in Poland in 1904 to Berish and Rebecca, turned into this. Now, as satisfying as it was to see that big a change in someone's record, my favorite example of database information that expanded in all sorts of ways belongs to a Joseph Dunn, who came to our attention again through the 1942 Jewish Congress list. He's buried in Calgary under a simple military marker that provides little more than basic information. And if you do the math from the information on the headstone, he would have been over 40 when he served. Well, according to his papers, he was born in 1896, not the 1898 that would be indicated by his headstone. And he would, in fact, have been 44 when he enlisted, working as a waiter at the Club Cafe in downtown Calgary. His next of kin is identified as Rita Belanger Dunn, who's described as a common law wife, which was not the most common arrangement in Calgary in 1940. He was taken on strength in June of that year and sent to England the following January. His service was uneventful. In the fall of 1941, he spent 2 weeks in hospital, and the next spring, he was repatriated to Calgary and discharged as being unable to meet the required physical standards. Now, all of that information in itself would have been enough to make it worth requesting his records, but it gets better. We also learned that when he did ship out to England, it wasn't actually his first trip. His attestation paper notes prior military service with the Canadian Ordnance Corps in 1918. So we went back to the Library and Archives Canada records into World War I and discovered several interesting things. For starters, when he enlisted in 1918, he said that his birth date was 1895, which contradicts both what he attested to in 1940 and the date suggested by his headstone. Also of interest, in 1918, he was already a waiter at the Club Cafe in downtown Calgary, and in fact was using that as his current address. His next of kin had been recorded as his father, Maurice, but there was an undated amendment changing that to his wife, Mrs. Eva Grace Dunn. Now, curiosity, of course, makes me wonder what happened to Eva, because if the marriage ended without a legal divorce, that would speak to his later common law relationship with Rita Belanger. Unfortunately, that's beyond my current parameters. The other point of note in Joseph Dunn's papers is that they show that individual records were not just kept by Library and Archives Canada, but they were updated, as you can see from his 1919 discharge document, which was updated when he died in 1953. The updating of information does take on an interesting tone when we're looking at the records of military casualties. Our database includes several veterans connected to Southern Alberta who died in service, if not in combat, and 13 who were killed in action. Their LAC records open a fascinating window into just both the details of their service and the procedures that followed their deaths. In the case of Rifleman William Maloff, who died and was buried in the field in France in August 1944, the file contains copies of the overseas casualty notifications, telegrams and letters sent to the family, and also a memo dated October 1944 that states, "The sister of this deceased soldier attended at the branch today. She advises me that her parents do not read or write English, although her brother George, 16 years of age, lives with them and is able to interpret." This was followed in December by the provincial registration of death, and eventually by pay summaries, confirmation of the distribution of his estate, and a verification form for his war service medals. Also included in his file is the internal documentation of his reburial in 1946, and a copy of the letter that was sent to his father stating that William's remains had been carefully exhumed and reverently reburied, and that the family would have the opportunity to personalize his marker. What's interesting about the marker is not only the Russian inscription at the bottom, but also that while it obviously marks the resting place of someone Jewish, Maloff is one of our veterans who enlisted as Presbyterian. The attestation papers of Charles Green, on the other hand, do note his religion as Jewish. Rejected by the Air Force when he first applied in March 1940 as being overweight for air crew, Green lost weight and was accepted in January 1942. He trained as an air bomber and arrived in England in March 1943 and was reported missing that August. His file includes copies of a series of letters addressed to his parents over a period of several years. 15 August 1943. It is with great sorrow that I write to you after the loss of your son Charles, missing as a result of air operations on the night of 11-12 August 1943. Your son was flying as an air bomber in a Wellington aircraft, which had visited a target in France and suffered damage by defenses. The pilot succeeded in getting the aircraft to the south coast of England, crash landing in the sea just off Shoreham. Your son, together with the rest of the crew, had just completed operational training at the unit, and we had every confidence in all members. 30 August 1943. It is with deep regret that I must confirm the information which you have already received. For official purposes, your son's category will remain missing, believed killed. 22nd March 1944. I have learned with deep regret that your son, Sergeant Charles Green, is now, for official purposes, presumed to have died on active service overseas on August 12, 1943. I would like you to know that his loss is greatly deplored by all those with whom your son was serving. 20th October 1944. I am directed to advise you that your son, Charles Green, has been promoted to the rank of Flight Sergeant with effect from August 1943. It is my sincere hope that you may find sustaining comfort in the knowledge that the qualities of your gallant son are thus recognized. 20 June 1952. It is with reluctance that after so long an interval, I must refer to the loss of your son, Flight Sergeant Charles Green. But due to the lack of any information concerning him since he was reported missing, it must be regretfully accepted and officially recorded that he does not have a known grave. All such servicemen will be commemorated on general memorials to be erected at a number of locations, including Runnymede, England, and the name of your son will appear on that memorial. I realize that this is an extremely distressing letter and that there is no manner of conveying such information to you that would not add to your heartaches. I am fully aware that nothing I may say will lessen your great sorrow, but I would like to express to you and the members of your family my deepest sympathy. The importance of memorials, of markers, can't be understated, not just for emotional reasons, but for research purposes as well. There were times when we became aware of an individual, not because they appeared on a list, but because they were in a cemetery. Or even, in my favorite unexpected discovery, because someone else was. You see, one day I was looking randomly at Calgary headstones, and I happened to notice one for a Royal Fusilier named Harry Cohen. Now, that was a British regiment, so his particular story did not fit the parameters of my research. But the name is Harry Cohen. He is one of 4 Harry Cohens who are buried in Calgary. And I started wondering just how many Harry Cohens there are out there and how many of them served for some country, some war, somewhere. So I went into the Library and Archives Canada World War I database, entered the name Harry Cohen, and among the many returns, learned about this Harry Cohen, who we had never known, born in Odessa, Russia in April 1897. I don't know when he came to Canada, but when he enlisted in March 1916, he was ranching in a place called Barons, Alberta, about 2 hours south of the city of Calgary. The medical section of his attestation paper notes that he was 5'5" and 150 pounds, with dental issues not sufficient to cause rejection and no distinctive marks or scars. He was assigned to the 13th Canadian Mounted Rifles and arrived in Liverpool that July. There he transferred to the PPCLI, Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, and went to France to join his unit in the field. Now, the records of many veterans are filled with troop movements, but Cohen's tell a different story. In October 1916, just a month after arriving in France, he was evacuated, having been shot in the hand. He returned to his unit and served uneventfully until he was again evacuated at the end of March 1917 with gunshot wounds to his head and leg. These injuries were more severe, and it was early May before he rejoined his unit. Then in September 1918, Cohen was shot yet again, this time in the hip. He was discharged from hospital at the end of October and again returned to his unit. In January 1919, he began the process of demobilization. The medical form that was completed at the end of his service notes many distinctive marks and scars. And apparently, while in France, waiting for his return to Canada, he had 2 teeth filled. Now, the genealogy packages don't always include records regarding mental and physical health. And when they do, they're rarely as busy as Harry Cohen's. They're often just standard paperwork, forms ticked off or filled in, routine assessments that were part of overall interviews without much detail. Sometimes when there are details, it can present a bit of a quandary. For example, we have a number of veterans who were treated for conditions of, shall we say, a rather personal nature. And even after all the time that has elapsed, I really don't feel that that's anyone's business but theirs. And for some reason, I feel very protective of the fellow whose file describes him as suffering from piles, flat feet, and sinus trouble. I don't know why I find that so funny, but it is somehow such an unfortunate combination of conditions. Some conditions obviously were more serious than others. And even more delicate are some of the references to the mental health of those who served. Part of the enlistment process included preliminary assessments, and for every file that indicates that a recruit is potential officer material or very focused and ambitious, there are some that note that the individual is anxious or troubled, or sometimes not very bright. As time went on, a number of veterans developed various psychological challenges, sometimes related to their military experience and sometimes not. And very rarely would I consider it appropriate to share such details. But I want to end this presentation by telling you about someone whose story really can't be told without alluding to their psychological state. And his story is truly integral to the Jewish War Veterans of Southern Alberta World War I and II database and the ongoing work that surrounds and supports it. Etsy Sidorsky from Lethbridge. First of all, he was a man of many names. He shows up in various sources as Isidore, Isaac, Izzy, and Etsy, which is what his family called him. His headstone in Montreal reads Itzky. He was born on October 10th, 1910, a birth date, 10-10-10, that was thought to be family lore until his attestation papers confirmed it. He was one of 7 children, 4 boys and 3 girls, born to Ari and Freda in Białystok, Poland. His papers note that he had only 4 years of schooling because the family were refugees for many years following World War I. They also note that Etsy spoke 6 languages: English, Polish, Yiddish, German, Russian, and Ukrainian. Etsy and one sister were the only members of the immediate family to leave Europe before the war, coming to Calgary in 1930. Presumably because of the extended family still in Poland, his service file includes notes on interviews that were conducted to ascertain his alien status, and many pages of his records have restricted, handwritten across the top. On the family information form Etsy completed on enlistment in 1943, it asks about the soldiers' parents, whether they're still alive. Etsy answered, unknown, in Poland. And again, when asked for their address, unknown. Family lore holds that his main reason for enlisting was to try and get back to Poland, to try and find them. A psychiatric evaluation conducted in February 1945, soon after his arrival in Europe, noted that he was under considerable distress due to worry over the welfare of his family, and that he did not want to talk about it. Etsy remained in the army in Europe for almost a year following the end of hostilities. His multilingual abilities were put to good use, translating for people who were leaving the camps. And family lore, again, says that he went AWOL during this time to look for his family. There is no mention of him being AWOL in his files, although he did have several leads. But by the time he was demobilized and returned to Canada in August of 1946, the truth is the fate of Etsy's family was no longer unknown. And I don't know whether or not he continued to not want to talk about it. I can't speak to the specific details of how Etsy was when he came back to Canada. But I do know from more than one source that he was not the same. He went back to work in the furniture store he'd opened in Lethbridge with his brother-in-law before the war, and he went back to his life. But there were times when he wasn't well, when he wasn't at all well. There was something off about him, something odd, something that was noticeably not right. And one of the people who noticed was a young boy named Bernie Gert. And when the boy asked, what's wrong with that man? He was told that the man had been a soldier, that he had been in the war. And the boy grew up and he learned about war, and he began to understand something of what it might have been like to have been a soldier, to have been a Jewish soldier in that war. And the boy remembered the man who had been a soldier. Bernie remembered Etsy. And he realized how much more there was to Etsy's story than he'd known at the time. And he wanted to make sure that that wasn't forgotten. For me, and perhaps for you too, that's the importance of these stories, of these attestations. The people who served were more than just names on a list. Each was an individual with their own context and their own story to tell. The more we know about them through their attestation papers as well as other resources, the more real their stories become. And the more real their stories become, the more likely it is that we'll continue to remember. Thank you.
Roberta, that was beautiful. Thank you for sharing these stories with us. We do have a bunch of questions, so I will start with those. Deborah said when you were talking about Toby Molly that she was told the American Army paid better than the Canadian Army.
Oh, interesting. That could well be. I'll make a note of that.
What's really interesting is it's really hard to get into nursing school in the United States now because there's not enough teachers.
Right.
I have a daughter who's hoping for that career path, and it's really hard to get in. So that's interesting.
Yeah.
What was the original reasoning for starting this project?
It was Bernie Gert. It was that man who left Southern Alberta many years ago, but still has very strong and fond memories of his childhood, his growing up there. And he was in a position to do something, and he'd been a member of our society. And he suggested that he would be willing to underwrite a major project, preferably something to do with veterans. He, I guess, has very, very strong memories of seeing Etsy going about his business, sometimes fine and sometimes very not fine. And it was very important to him that he honor the veterans from our community. So that was the genesis of it. We did a program, one of our AGMs centered around the veterans, and then we went on to develop the database.
And I believe Bernie is on this call with us.
I sure hope he is, because he has continued to support the work that we do. We just submitted last month, another raft of requests for more records. So it's very much an ongoing project that we are so grateful that we have the support.
I muted myself. I am
Yes.
on the call.
You are on the call. Do you
Oh,
want to turn
hello,
your
Bernie, welcome.
Bernie, did you want to turn on your camera and share a little bit about why this is so important to you? Because I think people would really be interested in hearing that.
I grew up during the war, and right after the war, I knew a number of families that had lost children in the war, families, people who came back from the war as veterans, and the person in Calgary, Burdick Filmiak, he was in charge of the headed up the Jewish war veterans in Calgary.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm not sure who it was at the time. Later, it was Val Reimer. If that was
He was headed up
Val
the
Reimer
war.
or
Val Reimer, yes, Val Reimer.
Yeah.
I used to curl with Val Reimer, and I knew
Oh.
him quite well, and he's also married into my family.
Well, thank you so much for underwriting this program and then it being shared with the rest of us. It's really very much appreciated. Roberta, would you mind unsharing your screen?
Oh, of course.
Thank you. Let's see. So is it a family member that originally tries to get this information, or you're just going through, papers and find Jewish people and take it from there? How does it originate and start?
We developed our initial lists through a number of resources. We did have access to the files of the Jewish war veterans here in Calgary, which is now defunct, but we were in close contact with them and had their membership lists. And we had documentation through local B'nai B'rith, through Jewish Congress, and the veterans here had published a book called Memories on the March, and many people contributed snippets of not just their own wartime experiences, but quite often they mentioned other people who had also served. So that's how we compiled our lists. And then we started just searching to see if we could find the people. As I mentioned, in Canada, a veteran has to have been deceased for 20 years before we can get their records. So there are a couple of cases where we've gotten records through family members, if the person hadn't been dead for that long. But in most cases, we have an ongoing list, and every year we take another look at it and see what other records we can request. And we're still finding people that we hadn't known about. Very recently, we were given a bunch of old photographs from somebody, and in a group photo, there was a fellow in uniform, and the name was familiar. And in fact, it was somebody who was not living in Calgary at the time of his enlistment, but he did come to Southern Alberta very soon after, and we hadn't known that he had served. So we were able to add him to our list. So that is sort of surprisingly, even just the accumulation of names is ongoing.
What's the significance of waiting 20 years? Is there a reason for that?
We don't know specifically. That's what the rule is. The person has to have been deceased for more than 20 years.
You read all those letters that went back and forth to the family of the gentleman who lost his life. Yeah. Is that a common occurrence that those types of letters are sent? I mean, it went on for almost 9 years. Yes.
That's the thing that's what really struck us. Now, in most cases, it doesn't go on for that long because the process of burial, memorialization, whatever it is shorter. In his case, it went on for that long because he had been lost at sea. But yes, any of the individuals who died in combat, there was that level of communication with the families. And what's fascinating, after some of the more major engagements toward the end of the war, the letters are still beautifully written, but they are a little bit more form letters. Obviously, they were writing hundreds, if not sadly thousands of them at a time. But casualties earlier in the war, there's a real sense when you read these letters that it was somebody who was sitting there writing this letter. It wasn't a nameless process. There was a real
Right.
personal
It wasn't
involvement on the part
it
of the
wasn't a mail merge.
exactly.
Yeah, some of them, yeah. How big is the Jewish community now in Alberta?
The community itself, we can't say for sure. Of course, there's an awful lot of unaffiliated individuals. Somewhere between 8 and 10,000. I think 10 would be overly generous. Or that's about in Calgary. Well, no, but really, the community throughout Southern Alberta is quite small outside the city. So I would stick to that, somewhere between 8 and 10,000. The population of Calgary, for those who don't know, is 1 million now.
Where?
So it's a fairly small 1.24. I'm Trudy is holding up her fingers, but I can't see how many. So we are 3. She's got 1.3 million. So it is a fairly
very small percentage.
And always has been historically. Sometimes it's been just over 2%. But usually has been less than 1.
I guess it's hard for those of us who are from Chicago, and I grew up in New York, so yeah. It's hard to fathom, such a small community. Yeah, but obviously a very involved community, which speaks for itself. So
well, it's something that came up, in fact, in the recollection of one veteran who is originally from Ontario but came out here to train. And what really struck him about the small communities was how connected they were. And of course, it was because they had to be. If you were in a big city with thousands and thousands of co-religionists, for lack of a better word, you didn't necessarily really have to get along with everybody because there was somebody else that you could do with. If there's only a few hundred of you, you pay a little more attention. You are a little bit more perhaps polite, and certainly much more supportive of one another, regardless of personal feeling. There's a much stronger impetus to put the good of the community ahead. So,
and I think that gets lost. I think that gets lost in bigger communities. We're having a conversation about, living and working in your community when you're a Jewish professional, and how sometimes that's really difficult for us because you don't necessarily get to separate yourself from, whatever Jewish organization you work for. You're out and about, and someone wants to talk to you about a program at JCC Chicago, but you're with your husband or your mom or your family. So it's a hard thing, for us. So Evelyn said she remembers your grandfather, Dr. Alex Belkin, a very respected member of Calgary's community.
Yes, he was a doctor, and originally from Winnipeg. He was in a very small town in Saskatchewan prior to the war. When he enlisted, he was the doctor in a place called East End, Saskatchewan, for many years. And when he was enlisted, he was posted to England. And at the end of hostilities, he was then posted to the Veterans Hospital here in Calgary. And that's how that branch of the family ended up here in the city. And he did practice here, stayed in the reserves through the 1960s and maintained his practice here until his death.
Sam Fishman said, Roberta, very interesting presentation and the means of collecting all the information.
Thank you, Sam. Yes, it's a pleasure and an honor to do it.
Susan Podlog says, when attestation records come to a family member, a name of the clerk doing the search is named. So the process of showing some care, some human response is identified, much like the care Roberta speaks to in the early letters to family members when someone who lost or died in action.
Yes, that's very true. And we have, our records have all been pulled by one particular clerk. And this is now going over a period of several years that we've been working on this project. And we've developed a very lovely relationship with this gentleman. And he cares, I think, as much for our veterans as we do. And I don't think that his circle, until these requests started coming in. I don't know how aware he was of the Jewish community in general, and certainly not on the level, the whole idea that when you're looking, want to confirm it's the right veteran by the father's name, but the only way that we know the father's name is off the headstone, so it's his Hebrew name, and we don't know what the English name was. He's gotten so good at deciphering all of that, and it is definitely again, there certainly is that personal touch on the part of the LAC, sure.
You noted that many of the people that you talked about were originally from Europe, Poland, Russia. Is there any confirmation that those people were actually, there were groups of people that were brought over specifically to Canada from, they were allowing people to immigrate? Is there any connection to, we met with an author who wrote the book, The Montreal Shtetl, and that's where a lot of these people landed and stayed and started their family. Do you know if there's any connection to those groups that Canada allowed to come into the country?
There was some. It was slightly different on the prairies. We do have a number of communities, and several of our veterans, in fact, did come from some of the homesteading communities, and they were often people who came out under some of those umbrella programs that brought groups of immigrants. But that isn't something that was quite so much a factor on the prairies as it was in the eastern centers.
Susan was asking if the people who do the research are volunteers, or are these paid positions? How does that work?
The work, I assume that the question is about the people who are doing the research for Jewish Historical Society. And that is, it is, I am the one who does the majority of that, and I do get paid for my work. Although I certainly, because I like the work so much, I tend not to put in for quite as many hours as I actually might, because it is very labor intensive and full of rabbit holes. The more you read, the more you realize, oh, there's something else that you want to look up, or it triggers something else. And I sometimes feel rather guilty about billing for all of the time that I put in. Certainly, it is something that volunteers could do, especially once they were familiar with the word, or with the fields that we have in the database and the specific information that we're looking for that purpose, as opposed to just for our subject files.
Is there one particular part of doing this research that you enjoy the most, or that grabs you the most, or is it just the general idea of really finding out about the lives of these people?
I think it is the general idea of it. It is so easy to not count them as individuals, to say, oh, we have this many veterans, but it's the fact that their stories, on the one hand, their stories are all the same, and yet they're so not. Even within, you think about people who married while they were in service. Well, there's probably 5 or 6 little subgroups with the people who married while they were in service. So even people who have those stories, each one is so distinct. And of course, it is delightful when we find somebody that we didn't know was ours. That's a marvelous thing. Or someone that we've been looking for their record and can't find it. And then all of a sudden, we stumble across something, usually during an unrelated search. We'll stumble across something that then opens the door for us.
Deborah was asking, did Jews from Calgary serving stay in touch with each other at all during their service?
Oh, that's a good question. And in fact, some of them did. Yes, never mind. We do the 2 brothers that I mentioned who enlisted together. But we do have many instances of people connecting when they were overseas. We have photographs that are taken in random places in Europe, where these 2 hometown boys who run into each other, and they, of course, were so excited to see somebody from back home. And yes, we do. They did keep as on top of that as they could, so that they would know who to keep their eyes open for, depending on where they were.
Is there any one particular story that you found so far that just really stays in your mind and really gets you every time you reread it or find another piece of information?
Certainly Etsy's story. I cannot tell you how many times I've told the story, and I have never been able to tell it without welling up. I just can't. And I change the wording, and I can't talk about or think about Etsy without getting emotional about it. I am quite touched by the stories of the nurses, and I would love to get access to their records at some point. Two of them talk about being in France at the end of the war and taking food from their own rations and taking them to the DP camps that were nearby and sharing them with the people who were in the camps. That I find very touching. There are lots of stories. There was a doctor who had been discharged. She'd served overseas and come back to Southern Alberta. And within a few months of his return to Lethbridge, he died of stomach cancer. And he was declared a military casualty and buried with full honors. And I find that that very touching. And again, shows that awareness of these people as people, not just as numbers. He was technically out of the army by then, by the time he died, but it was felt that he deserved the military honor, and that I find touching.
You bring up an interesting point. In general, are veterans in Canada respected and taken care of once they come back? Generally speaking, I mean, in the United States, I think we have a bit of a problem with how we care for our veterans after they've been engaged in, other countries and wars and stuff. Just a personal question. I'm wondering.
Yeah, I would say that for the most part, certainly when it comes to veterans of earlier conflicts, I think there is a lot of respect for them and for the work that they did. More recent conflicts, it's harder to gauge. We don't have the same perspective, I don't think, on things that are more in our lifetime than what was happening earlier. And the conflicts that have taken place during our lifetime, we often don't understand or can't connect to in a particularly personal way. So it can make it a little bit more difficult sometimes to support the general idea of military service, of greater good. All of those principles, I think, are more challenging for us now. Beyond that, I can't really say.
I think that's an interesting way to look at it. More, maybe my grandchildren someday will look at,
Right.
veterans of the Iraqi war differently than, we look at it right now.
Yes. Yeah.
Susan said World War II vets received many financial benefits that supported vets as they aged.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, and we do have, there's the veterans, veterans groups here. I mean, there is annual campaigns, there are food banks, there are a number of ongoing supports for them still. So
I think that was the last comment question, Roberta. So
okay.
I found this fascinating. And what I have to say is I told you earlier that 31 people registered for the program. And so we're coming to the end and 27 people are still here, which means it was a huge success and it was of great interest. So when people come and they stay for the whole thing, I wasn't really sure what to expect. And it was really interesting. If you get more information and put together something on women during that time,
Sure.
it's an it's an interest of Eileen and I's. We're always interested in hearing about women who, were behind the scenes really during World War II. And
Yes.
we would love to have you come back. So thank you everyone for joining us. I know that there were people who weren't able to join us. I will get the recording to Katie. It'll also be on our JCC Chicago YouTube page. Please visit our JCC Chicago webpage at jccchicago.org. We've got lots more exciting stuff coming up, interesting topics. Next week, we are visiting with the Historical Society of Southwest Florida. So you can find that information on our website. Roberta, again, thank you so much for your expertise and your emotional, I mean, everyone could really feel the emotion. So thank you for that. And everyone who crossed the border to join us today, thank you so much. Take care and be well.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.